Welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. I think a lot of listeners of this podcast are quite familiar with different flavors of verifiable credentials. And there's one flavor of credential that has, I guess, been around for a while, but personally have just been seeing it gain a little bit more traction recently. And that is mobile driver's license. And I know we'll get into different components of that, and we'll go a little bit deeper inside the technical breakdown, the different specifications around it. But just to start off this conversation and just trying to frame this whole thing, it is a good way of looking at this, how it compares to verifiable credentials. Is like verifiable credentials just focus on building a credential and then trying to make that fit to a use case. And the mobile driver's license is the opposite of that. It's just pick the use case and figure out how to turn it into a credential. Is that a good framing?
It's definitely a good way to start considering the different credential types, including verifiable credentials model and things like the ISO mobile driver's license. The way I tend to describe it is that the different standardization communities had different starting points and different stakeholder requirements. For a mobile driver's license, there is international well-established driving permit system. There are UN conventions, which are similar to treaties, that cover international driving licenses, the data formats, the acceptance of, the production of, and what they're for. And ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, has subcommittees for driving licenses. Mobile driver's license is the digital version of the ISO standards driving license that we all are familiar with. And the stakeholders behind it are really the driving authorities. So ISO members are the national standards bodies around the world, and governments are heavily involved. And as issuers of driving licenses, they came together to make a digital version of the standardized mobile driver's license. Other credentials, like the verifiable credentials model, started more along the lines of a general purpose digital credential, thus had no single driving use case to focus on. There's benefits to both directions, as we know. And as we've seen over the last year, the target use cases and the applicability is actually starting to converge, because there's a lot of overlap. And there's formats within mobile driver's license is actually a profile or a specialization of the mDoc format, which is a general purpose credential in its own. It's less well known because driver's licenses are a very attractive use case. And, who knows which credential formats will prevail. 10 years, the landscape will be completely different. But we're in the very early days of emergence of these different formats and styles and approaches.
Would you consider that the mDoc format or the mobile driver's license fits within the whole decentralized identity ecosystem? And maybe it's worth taking a look at how you look at what the centralized ID is and what you think is appropriate or maybe not appropriate with that categorization. But does the mobile driver's license fit within the same bucket as all of these other credentials that are being deployed today?
I hope your podcast listeners have a sense of humor, because I'm about to put a little humorous thing in here. The term decentralized identity is a non-existent term. It describes nothing. It's a philosophical point of view in my mind. What it intends to convey, and it does convey quite well, is a distribution of authority to make claims and authority to hold verified data. So individuals can hold identification data, claims data, identity data where they wish, and they can reassert it as they wish. That's really the sense of the decentralization. There are other flavors, as we know, self-sovereign and so on. In terms of the issuer, holder, verifier kind of paradigm, mobile driver's licenses are the same. They are not W3C verifiable credentials specifically. They're not designed to be, they're not intended to be, but they do have an issuer that issues a digitally signed object that can be held and presented independently by the user, the person, from their digital wallet. There's ways to do basically blinded integrity checks, pulling public keys from non-monitored repositories is possible. You can do selective disclosure or selective release of data attributes within mDL. There's an unfortunate part in the ISO 18013 Part 5 standard that describes a server call home functionality. Several of us didn't really like that in there, but it does have its uses, and we could not justify removing it because some issuers actually have the right and the requirement to have data retrieval from servers as their model. But we're seeing in the US specifically, and more in Europe and Australia, that the person-held wallet stored independent credential is the chosen implementation pattern, similar to the concepts behind the W3C verifiable credential and verifiable presentation structures.
So it might be worth talking a little bit. I did want to get into privacy preservation with these credentials at some point in this conversation, so we could get into it sooner rather than later. It would be interesting for the listeners to hear just how these different standards have evolved. You just referred to the 18013-5, I believe. I believe there's a newer one being worked on. It would be interesting just to hear how these things have been evolving, just to start to paint the picture for how these things could possibly be consumed a little bit more in the near future on the internet.
As with any other standardization efforts, it follows a strange path from concept to reality. In the ISO workgroups, the work started on the 18013 Part 5 standards for mobile driver's license application. It's Part 5 because there are actually Parts 1 through 4 that describe the physical driver's license. So this is just Part 5. Part 5 describes the data structure, the data integrity mechanism, salted hashes, lifecycle management of the cryptographically signed data structures, data integrity, and so on. The mechanism for selective release of those attributes, and request response protocol between the verifier and the holder. And also, part of the innovation was transport protocols for use of QR code and NFC to establish a session, and then switching over to NFC or Wi-Fi aware Bluetooth LE transport channels. Those did not really exist before 18013 Part 5. Now you'll notice that those are all local radios and optical. It was done on purpose because the stakeholders, being the driver licensing issuers, wanted first and foremost to have similar capabilities to the physical plastic. So in-person presentation was very important to them. And to cut the scope down to actually allow the thing to be published last year, or 2021, I guess, October, the workgroup decided to do the in-person local radio modes first. Since then, we've been working on 18013 Part 7, which is remote presentation over the internet of the mDL. And really what this is adding another transport mechanism to the existing transports from 18013 Part 5, this one being over the internet, whatever that means. Now, I clearly to the listeners, over the internet means nothing, but we're describing two different transports. One is using we're calling it a REST API. It isn't REST, and it's not really an API. It's basically using the 18013 Part 5 request response protocol over TCP/IP and HTTPS. And also, we're specifying a profile of OpenID for verifiable presentation from the OpenID Foundation as another transport protocol for over the internet. And then the critical innovation here is how to do authentication of the origin. So, of course, over the internet, you can't look at the person and you can't look at the verifier with your eyes. And we're spending quite a bit of time trying to figure out how to ensure that the URL that you're sending your mDL to is actually the one you thought it was. Right. So things to counter phishing, things to confirm the origin. It's not 100% possible when the website verifier is on a different device from your mDL. That's not a solved problem yet with the current technology anywhere. But on the same device, so if you're browsing using a mobile browser and then asserting your mDL to the website on your phone, of course, you have different mechanisms to transfer the URL securely from app to app. In addition to that, because who doesn't need a 15th standard? Let's see, standard XKCD reference. The ISO workgroup is developing a family of standards, 23220, multiple parts, that describe issuance, general data formats and structures and integrity mechanisms, a range of presentation and transport protocols, security levels, security features, mechanisms, that sort of thing, overall architectures, and we're calling it building blocks for mobile EID, from which you will see that 18013 Part 5 and Part 7 are profiles, a specialization strictly for mobile driver's license. But as we mentioned earlier in this podcast, the MDoc format and the presentation methods and transport methods are general purpose for electronic IDs. And that's where the general purpose stuff is being written.
Is there a reason why an issuer would want to select, and we could talk about a driver's license versus other type of use case, but in your point of view, what would make a decision maker in an issuing body decide to issue a credential using 23220 specifications versus using a verifiable credential? So if I'm issuing a mobile driver's license, what would make me want to issue it as a government Ministry of Transportation using mDL versus using a verifiable credential? And what would make me, if I was issuing a non-mobile's driver's license, maybe it's the same answer, use the same general purpose 23220 versus another type of verifiable credential?
That's the billion-dollar question, right? And notice the inflation there. So if you're a driving license or state ID or a government-issued electronic ID identification document issuer, it makes sense to go with ISO standards because, the national standards bodies are the members of ISO. So it's a safe organization to follow for standardization as a government. And also because the issuing authorities for driving offices, driving permits, collaborated in writing the standard is fit for purpose. So for a driving license, it tilts towards the ISO standard. For general purpose credentials and identification documents, we have no idea. We have no idea which formats and which paradigms issuers will choose. If they invest heavily in ISO versus non-ISO infrastructures, it may make sense from a cost and efficiency perspective. One thing that we found as in the ISO committee and also in the decentralized identity places that I participate in as well, is that it's kind of hard to get into the heads of the issuers and the administrators of the issuers. They, as every other business or organization, have multiple pressures, budget, efficiency, knowledge base, who are their actual customers. Very hard to synthesize that from the outside. What I'm hearing is that choosing the ISO format for official government documents is generally an easier thing, less risk to the issuer. However, it doesn't have the same capabilities, perhaps, as some of the newer cryptographic formats, newer approaches. And also, this is such an early time in any kind of digital credentials that are mass produced and massively consumed. We don't know what developers and software solution providers and issuers and verifiers and the whole ecosystem, we don't know what they want to build. Issuers will typically, not always, but typically will buy a software solution from a software vendor or buy into a paradigm. And they'll invest in that. So they'll train, they'll seek other partners, seek ecosystems, and so on. And that drives their sort of generational choice. Most of the driving offices, the DMVs in the US, see this as a digital transformation, and they're taking it seriously. There are some early adopters, states that are going early, partly because their systems were falling over and they had to, and partly because they're more willing to take on risks. There's a whole lot of states that are waiting to see what happens over the next few years as the world learns about verifiable credentials and mobile driver's licenses. In the ISO community, at least, we're taking steps, making progress on making sure that things like OpenID foundation protocols, like the OpenID for VC, are embedded in the standards so that we don't have to train every single developer on a new way of doing things. It's very important to us because we view adoption as critical. And we know that around the world, different credential infrastructures and approaches are doing similar things. My sort of take on it is that within the next 10 years, we'll see what shakes out, which is pretty quick when you consider sort of how recent all this stuff is. And I know everyone else has a different point of view, but 5 years, 10 years is going to be lightning fast in this space.
Are there downsides that you could point out with the current implementations of the mobile driver's license? You mentioned that in 18013-5 standard, there was a call home functionality, which is perhaps important for some use cases, but important not to have in other use cases. So maybe this is one possible downside for certain use cases, but are we comparing apples to apples here or apples to oranges when looking at different flavors of verifiable credentials versus the mobile driver's license stuff?
What we're comparing is a specific use case versus a general models. So I always have problems having the, what does it better discussion, because the answer is you can't compare. Mobile driver's license, ISO mobile driver's license, is a fit for purpose standard. It's designed specifically to transport name value pairs using a very quite simple data integrity mechanism, salted hashes with indexed arrays, using government accepted cryptography. It's been tested and tried for many years. Does it do fancy stuff like zero knowledge proofs? No. Will it? Yeah, probably, but not today. Once we get beyond the use case for the profile, the mDL profile, things get hazy. So, like I mentioned, zero knowledge proofs in a mobile driver's license as a driving permit use case, zero knowledge isn't really a primary scenario because typically you're presenting the driving license to a regulated verifier or the government or law enforcement, all of which actually have a purpose, a stated purpose that is clearly communicated and understood, to receive the data that the person releases. It's not ambiguous, with proof of age maybe, but we have the ability to do proof of age claims as opposed to date of birth statements. The server retrieval of data, if that's a form of correlation that is unacceptable in use case, then don't implement that. It's kind of the scenario there. So yeah, it unfortunately depends on the use case. Interestingly, and I don't take this as a negative thing on the standard, but there's no revocation mechanism in ISO 18013. What happens is the security object expires. So the verifier knows that the signed data is recent or not, has a current signature or not, and then can take appropriate actions. Revocation is a mechanism for correlation. It's very, very hard to not correlate using a revocation mechanism. And there's all sorts of protections and things that you would need to define to avoid correlation using revocation mechanisms. So in that way, not having an explicit revocation mechanism is both a positive and a negative. Now, of course, once a truly universal key revocation mechanism is invented, because as far as I know, they don't really exist yet, every credential and PKI system will probably use it. But there's not a winning candidate yet for that.
It's interesting to talk about the fit for purpose use case, because you could talk about the primary use case of a driver's license to check eligibility of being able to drive a specific class of vehicle or what, right? Like that's the main purpose why a Ministry of Transportation issues that. But there's a whole bunch of secondary uses for this driver's license as well.
The second major class of fit for purpose, the purpose for these driver's licenses, is when a verifier or relying party says, show me government issued photo ID, because driver's licenses typically are that as well. So is it an identification document? Yes. Is it a driving permit? Yes. Is it both? Sometimes, right? So sorry, go on.
What's interesting with the mobile driver's license and coming out of ISO, like the members of ISO are governments. They're going to be more comfortable with obviously international standards. They're going to be more comfortable with standards that they're a part of drafting and involved in different elements of the process there. And I don't know if there's a difference between printing a physical driver's license or a digital driver's license, because in a physical driver's license, there's still going to be secondary use cases for it. Like I walk into a bar and they need to prove my age of majority, just that classic example. But especially as these specifications move more towards open over the internet with the -7 specification, it feels like there's going to be more and more possible utilization of this, more and more possible verifiers that will want to consume that data. So do issuers of mobile driver's licenses, who are obviously the same issuers of physical driver's licenses, consider the mDL as a driver's license, or do they really consider it as an ID document? Because it seems like the latter is a bit more of a transformative thought.
So I've actually asked them. So as part of my work in various places, I interact with the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, or AMVA. It's an association for DMVs in North America, Canada, and US. And I do ask them that. I say, like, okay, so in Arizona, is it a driving permit or is it an ID card? And the answer is, it's both. Then, is it universally accepted as both among every single US state? And the answer is no. Some states view it as a driving permit. Some states view it as combination card. Some view it as identification. Every US state and Canadian province has a mechanism to issue a non-driving identification document, right? So it's hard to separate them. But I would say that in the transformation of thinking that's happening in North American governments, at least, has been for a while, these are actually identification documents that have entitlements for driving permits attached to them. That's really what they are becoming. And of course, with digital, you can make them whatever you need them to be. So if you need to have a true identification document, given an mDL as a starting point, well, you can make it that by filtering, by redacting, by putting constraints on presentation, that sort of thing. Again, we don't really know how these things are going to be used. The issuers feel, the driving license issuers are concerned about misuse of the mDLs, as they have always been with the documents they produce. We're starting to see them get more comfortable with the idea of issuing verified data in digital format, which is, by the way, what I think the breakthrough is the training of the transformative event here is the issuance of verified data from a government service. The credential format is secondary, but it's the yes, it's good. Yes, there are controls. Yes, it's safe and secure. People want it. If the state doesn't provide it, there's other companies that'll do something that looks like it, but isn't. So I think that's getting used to it. This is why I think it's the 5 to 10 year sort of thing, is that governments have to learn this new mechanism for issuance. It's not natural for governments to willingly release the data that they have carefully curated and carefully put into registries that they safeguard on behalf of the public. And as you yourself know, different governments are moving at different paces. So we've got the full spectrum of acceptance of the new paradigm, or we're going to be the last government to do it. sort of thing.
There's a lot of different approaches that we're seeing in the digital identity space, and even within, I guess, in Canada, within provincial governments, and then if we look in Europe within nation states, there's different ministries that have different thinking around how citizen identity credentials should be issued. For the driver's license credentials, I think one of the most attractive things to issuers of them are that there is support out there today, right? Not 90, I don't have the statistic in front of me, but I'm going to assume that over 90% of mobile devices that are in use today either use Apple's operating system or a Google operating system, which have support natively built in for wallets, whether you want to use payments or whether or not you want to store identity cards on there. So I think for certain issuing bodies, it's quite interesting to see kind of the low lift that is needed to place a mobile driver's license within a wallet. Whereas on the other side, you're seeing a lot of traction and a lot of push towards having nation state wallets and really make sure that there's not that dependency, I guess, on the mobile operating systems. I know that kind of fits outside of the standard work, but it's a thing that comes up very often in our space. I'd be interested to hear kind of what the landscape of digital driver's licenses looks like today versus kind of how it looks like in the physical, because in the physical space, I don't think Apple and Google are involved at all, but it seems that in the digital space, they're involved and they perhaps have some influence. So it'd be interesting to hear like what the ecosystem looks like today and if there are some risks that are happening with new parties that are involved here. It would be interesting to hear.
Yes, for issuers of driver's licenses, the golden handcuffs are very comfortable. It's a double-edged sword when dealing with platform and device hardware operating system level capabilities. They're very well aware of the trap of making non-transferable, device-dependent, vendor-dependent software and credentials. There are some US states that are experimenting with it. We've heard about the TSA acceptance of mobile driver's licenses and Apple's partnership with them to have these credentials in the Apple Wallet and presentable through the OS. In Europe, it's not really a default stance to allow hardware vendors and OS vendors to control government assets. So there's lots of initiatives like the EU Digital Wallet Initiative, the new Open Wallet Foundation coming out of Linux Foundation, to define architectures and technologies that can use capabilities of the OS and hardware without putting a layer of control over top of these wallets and key management systems that the person needs to get access to. In the current paradigm of some of the operating systems, they authorize who gets to put stuff on their platform into their stores, which is chilling, right? If the store owner decides that you do not conform to their rules and contracts, your wallet application won't go into the store and it can't be used on those kinds of devices. Everyone's aware of that. Now, how to deal with it is a different question. There's a growing appetite, especially coming out of the EU, to insist on more open access to hardware features and OS features that are available for use for additional software developers to use. How that's going to shake out, we don't know. But if adoption of any credential format is going to be universal, there are certain APIs and certain mechanisms that must be exposed. In some of the US states where they've accepted the offer from Apple and TSA to do the boarding of planes scenario, they're exploring and they're studying what it means to have a simple path through one dominant platform and a hard path through another one. It doesn't serve governments well to have that model, because all of a sudden it could be seen as preference of one system over another, which is not what governments do. They want accessibility, open access, to all their residents and citizens and anyone else that's eligible for the government service. So they're trying to figure out what to do about this and how to approach this. So we'll see a convergence of different approaches within a few years, but by no means should you expect the current status quo to remain the status quo. It just won't support the broad ecosystem that's required. Now, having said that, just writing an app with a wallet isn't a particularly good idea either, because having hardware-backed keys and secure storage and secure attestations about all the different parts that go into a digital wallet, that's critically important as well. So, if your gambling app says, I'm a ID credential wallet too, just put your driver's license here, you might not want to do that because they perhaps don't have the same access to the secure mechanisms that really should be there to protect the data.
Yeah, and I think there just needs to be a separation between the standards and the protocols coming out of the standards versus how it gets implemented. And it seems like there's a lot of iterations happening on the implementation side of things. Some are scarier than others, and you could start seeing risks, and different areas of the world are going at it differently. But I think it's important to just separate the discussion, whether or not we're talking about the actual standards that we're developing versus just how people are using them. Because you could use something like very well, or you could use it poorly, or there's all sorts of gray zones in between. So I think often when we hear certain conversation happening in the space, it's a good thing to just think about, are we talking about the standard itself, or are we talking about how people are using it?
Yes, and one of my favorite lines about standards, besides the 15th standard one, of course, is standards are voluntary. There's nothing that says you got to follow it. You can make it compatible with whatever you want as you're developing software, but there's no one standing over any developer's shoulder saying, "Oh, you missed a line." So implementation matters. Standard is for interoperability. So if you implement it in a certain way, you have guaranteed interoperability and testable interoperability with others that follow the same standard. How you implement your app around that standard and that capability, it's always going to be up to the person sitting at the keyboard. There's no desire and no way to actually control what they do. And with transport and data structure kinds of standards and protocols, it's hard to say this, but there's no way to prevent bad actors from abusing the standards and protocols. If it's not written in the standard, a bad actor might just write something else that does exactly the same thing, that doesn't interfere with the interoperability. So what we tend to see in any sort of communications field is associations coming up with standards of practice, certifications for evaluating how implementations were done, certifications for how closely implementations conform to standards. I participate heavily with Cantera Initiative, and we've got some ongoing work writing out requirements for, you might as well call it good behavior for issuers, wallet providers, and relying parties, verifiers, to try to set an expectation and just put it out there. And, in the beginning, there'll be voluntary conformance. Might, if wildly successful, become some sort of certification program. So if you want to be in that camp of acceptable to, certain stakeholders, and, there's extra costs and all that sort of drag, the extra costs. So there are ways to deal with it. And, the last and least desirable is, of course, regulation and legislation to prohibit certain uses. And that's a pretty high burden. So we hope not to get there, but it might happen down the road.
As we transition to more digital inside of this ecosystem altogether, so we just talked about kind of the operating system or hardware providers. Are there more parties that start to get involved here versus in the physical space? I know a lot of suppliers or printers in the physical space have moved to being issuers in the digital space. I'm assuming that there is centralized PKI and some root of trust, and in a lot of cases you want to make sure, at least in North America, that you're complying to AMVA, which I don't know if that impacts how you're signing or how you're certifying issuers. But in the physical space as well, it seems like the verifiers are somewhat controlled. I don't know if every single verifier, anyone could get a reader or do that. So how does the ecosystem change further, and does the way that the ecosystem is governed need to change further in the digital space versus physical?
I think we'll see an adaptation. There's obviously many different competing interests. Back to the point that the issuers don't want to harm the receivers of the credentials. So no issuer wants that, because it undermines trust. Still to be seen if mobile driver's licenses become a controlled document of some kind, where it can only exist in an authorized wallet. That would be an interesting and weird development, because there's so many ways to work around it, right? Of course. I keep hearing the theme of putting verified and known provenance information in the hands of people, so that their experiences online are better, more seamless, more frictionless. There's more possibility because it's digital, and you don't have to deal with taking pictures of plastic cards and all that. Innovation is going to happen. If I could predict how that innovation was going to happen, I wouldn't be talking to you. I'd be running my $50 billion company by now. No, what we're trying to do as an industry is get, where applicable for the use case and scenario, get those verified claims, the asserted claims from authorities, be it yourself, be it a government, be it anywhere in between. Start using the front channel, the person, to take the claims and data and present it where they wish, when they wish. Get away from the classical federation back channel, where the person has no actual direct control over how information flows, and put some of the control and some of the capabilities back in the hands of people. That long-standing ideal of user-centric, human-centric information flows. This is, be it mDLs or verifiable credentials, it's another step along the way, right? Where we're getting the issuers trained. People are ready for being able to hold and present credentials, and verifiers, relying parties, they're going to get there too. And we're seeing some movement along the way.
How is the adoption of the verifier or presentation use cases going in the spaces or the areas that have already launched mobile driver's licenses? Like, are there interesting use cases that we could talk about, like point of sale terminals, or are there new use cases that are emerging and that are starting to gain traction?
Just to remind you, I work for a company that's developing products in this space. So yes, there's incredibly interesting stuff going on. There's stuff going on that it's going to blow your minds. I can't talk about it. It's all the use cases you imagine, and others that you don't. The key is having the right combination of claims and credentials being presented to make decisions about authorization, entitlements, access, and so on, without necessarily having to do a server-side authentication. That's the key. There's no necessity to have a federation contract in place or a data access contract in place between the verifier relying party and the issuer, like you do today with federation. In most cases, of course, terms of service. That's the innovation in the pattern of information flows, right? It's the front channel being able to present where and when they wish, the person. The way I like to describe it to my colleagues and other places is the person can be the transport protocol for the information now. Whereas before you had to have TCP/IP to be the transport protocol, and the login and access keys and all that stuff was the transport. Now it's the person. And because the person isn't bound into the back channel, back office contracts, it allows more freedom. on what can happen and what could happen. And that's where the innovation is going to be, the things that we can't imagine yet. But the early days are going to be, workforce credentials showing that you work at a place, you have certain certifications, you have taken certain training courses, you're permitted to use this, that, or the other piece of software. Consumer use cases are going to be, tickets, membership cards, entitlement to programs, that sort of thing. Everyone loves the boarding pass kind of scenario where you do your pre-check-in, you get a credential, which is a combination of your ticket, your assertion that you are eligible to be in that seat on that plane, and your identification document, and other security documents that are required these days for background checks before you get on that plane. These are all, vaccination credential, all that, proof of a physical world event happening. Those are digital credentials now. All of those use cases are in pilot, in production today. There's no surprise there. Some of the magical ones we haven't seen yet. That's those are going to be fascinating as they start to arrive.
When looking at secondary use cases, I guess, of a mobile driver's license, how important is picking the right use case when you're trying to run pilots, or at least trying to build stickiness and that early adoption with early users? We could look at recent programs very recently right now shutting down in the UK, for example, the UK Verify program. Are there lessons that could be learned from previous rollouts, and how are different mobile driver's license rollouts looking at these secondary use cases, or maybe really trying to pick specific niches to create value in there and more stickiness?
Good program management is as or more important as good implementation and good underlying standards. Why there's lots of studies on why large programs fail. There is the classic problem of not understanding the actual requirement and basically implementing something that no one wants, which is more common than you would imagine. Yeah, I have no answer, because if your program directors believe that people want to renew their driver's license online, never line up again at a physical office, then that will shape the requirements and shape the implementation. If it truly is proof of age, that is the so-called killer use case that ends up in a different set of requirements and implementations. I don't know. I can't answer it, because there are too many possible answers.
It's sometimes difficult to find information coming out of ISO working groups. I don't know if it's by design that it's that way. I think we were talking at the start of this conversation that mDL and verifiable credentials are apples and oranges type of thing. We're not talking about the same thing. Is the same thing true about talking about ISO versus other organizations? Is it by design that it's very closed in as an organization? Are there improvements that could happen in ISO?
It's a fair comment, but ISO is just a membership organization, just like all the other ones. Every organization, especially doing collaborative work like standardization, there's rules about how to participate and who gets to see what. W3C has some as well that are as restrictive as ISO. Some are looser, some are not. Again, the membership basically determines the operating rules. If you're an individual trying to do work in an ISO subcommittee as an individual, it's not possible by design. That's because members are national standards bodies. However, there's many pathways to become a delegate of your nation national standards body. So that's how I work on the ISO committees, is I'm a delegate of Standards Council of Canada as a Canadian delegate. And they take a look at my resume and experience, make sure that my experience fits within the mandate of the committees that I'm committed to work within. And there's various rules and governance and all that. And every other national body that's a member of ISO does the same. W3C, for example, corporate members can send delegates to be on work groups for the specification development. There's also the community groups, which are more open, but to actually write words in the standards side of W3C, you have to be a paid up member or specifically invited. So different purposes for the organization, different models. Will they evolve? Absolutely. Will they evolve in ways that we like? Maybe. But yeah, so it's the way the ISO work works is anything at the working group level in drafting is not publicly available. It's only for members and delegates. Once it's published, then it's available for purchase. And that's a sticking point for many. But it's the funding model that ISO has in place. There are other standardization bodies that have the identical scenario and identical governance and funding models. And they have the same benefits and shortfalls as the other ones.
This is kind of a throw in here, but it's just one of the differences I've seen between this ISO standard and other verifiable credential standards is the way that we look at binding the credentials to the person. And it seems like a major difference in the ISO side of things where these credentials are bound, I believe, and you'll correct me, of course, if I'm wrong here, but to device type of thing. Is that, again, it's obviously a by design choice, but does that perhaps limit portability in future use cases between devices, or backup and restore use cases, or syncing across wallets or device use cases? And one thing that I was thinking of as well is that you could have multiple biometrics on a specific phone, right? It's like I could have different family members that are using the phone. They all have their biometrics, but I don't believe that on an Apple phone, for example, that the application necessarily knows who's accessing the application. That happens. Are there concerns or risks there? Again, I'm sure it was by design. If so, why? It would be interesting to just hear, because that seems like another key difference between different types of credentials.
You're right. And I've got a question back to you as well. Different requirements, different stakeholders, different choices in the standards. Yeah, there's a device key, but the principle behind the mDL is that the entire mechanism is intended to present the authentic and genuine assertion coming from the issuer to the verifier through the person's device. We also have the capability to have things like device signed assertions, where the root of trust is really the device, the person, not the issuer. So it's a split model. But really the primary thing is getting the assertions from the issuer over, making sure that the data is encrypted to the device, not to something that's portable, like that is directly portable. So design choice. That's a different question than the binding to the person question. And this is one of those unsolved problems. So in the ISO standards that require the person proof of binding of the person, what we've done there is basically said, prove possession and control of a private key using some to be defined binding mechanism that actually binds a real human being to that authorization of the private key, right? So we're leaving a blank space for when the technology actually exists. But it's all private key control. It's not really different from anything else. In the other credential formats, it's exactly the same problem. So there's no way to have any guarantees that the private key has been authorized by the right person, because there's no way to do it. I mean, you could try some biometric magic, maybe. There's some systems that do derived biometric templates that might be useful. They're not widespread. Passwords, well, yeah, that kind of binds to the person, but there's other problems with that. Iris biometrics, all the different ways, heartbeats. It's either intrusive, high risk or not invented yet. And once we get something that does it, everyone's going to use it. Same with revocation. And I know the revocation thing's a bit controversial. Everyone I talk to has their favorite mechanism, and they all have trade-offs. And maybe it's never solved. Maybe it's minimization of risk kinds of solutions. I know specifically in the verifiable credential world, there's a lot of discussion around holder binding. There's equal amounts of discussion in the ISO world about holder binding, holder verification, and precisely what that means. And in the ISO standards, at least, we've left the space. So, we're using the available mechanisms to do user authentication, person authentication, which is what it ends up being, knowing full well that it's not actual proof that it's the real, correct, authentic person, because we can't do that yet.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, if we're always trying to get everything perfect to 100%, we'll never deploy anything. And at the same time, it's just looking at the actual risk that's in front of us and seeing whether or not it's worth proceeding with something. But it definitely seems from this conversation that having governments issue digitally signed data through mobile driver's licenses is really a game changer and really sets a foundation for all sorts of future credentials being issued. And making them comfortable with this process here is just gonna increase the amount of verifiable data that gets out there in users' hands that could be controlled by users and used for use cases we can't even think about.
Yeah, and the next revolution is going to be teaching them about issuance of verified claims, right? So the zero knowledge claims and all that sort of stuff. So, first is the data, because it's easy to understand name value pairs. But issuing a claim of driving eligibility, that's a little bit beyond the institutional infrastructure, speaking generally. But once, making assertions from your core registry is a thing, it's not that big a step to say, oh, here's another thing that can be issued, and it has different privacy characteristics, different security characteristics. Let's just issue a claim of driving eligibility and see where that goes. So, yeah, I mean, it kind of does actually blow my mind. This transformation, as mundane as it appears, is actually going to change everything.
Yeah, I love that. I often talk about, I've said it multiple times on these podcasts, so that we typically, when we try to digitally transform a process, we just try to replicate what exists in the physical world in a digital space without thinking, just taking a step back and thinking at the tools we have in front of us now. And to achieve the outcome we're trying to achieve, we don't necessarily need to replicate it the same way. So that's a great point you made there as well, where you could start looking at more of a micro credential approach, and even an approach where it's just these claims are really more tied to the root of trust, where I could issue a claim about driving that someone's able to drive without adding these other data attributes around it that maybe I'm not the best suited person to issue those.
One additional thing in there is that it's easy to forget in the identity management and authentication world that the only people that matter, aside from the people, of course, but in the organization institution point of view, it's the relying parties, right? The relying party has to choose to accept the assertions that they're given based on their risk profile, based on what they want to accept, what they're able to accept. So what digital credentials in any form start to open up is the relying party has more clarity over the provenance of the data. So who actually was the issuer? And you can check it these days with digital signatures. Whose hands it passed through? So did it go through a third-party aggregator, or did it go through the user's wallet? They can actually do collection minimization now, whereas physically you can't. You just take the whole thing. Now there's mechanisms in all the emerging credential formats to redact data, which is huge. And relying parties will be able to take advantage of that. And also they can get more fine-grained information about basically the metadata of the credential and the presentation and the issuance that just is not available to them. So the more advanced relying parties who are able to take all these risk signals and metadata signals about authenticity and provenance, they will be able to move faster with less risk. Now that's not going to be a lot of them, but that's where a lot of the new value comes from, is now they're certain about the data. They're certain that it's fraudulent, right? Or they're certain that it couldn't be forged. So now they can make a faster decision on their side. Whereas today they got to go through manual steps and friction and all that stuff. And it takes longer and longer and more and more expensive. That's the promise of getting verified claims, verified data without having to go through contracts and SLAs and all that stuff on the backside. That's where we're going to see some really interesting stuff happen.
Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Mathieu Glaude on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.